We have reached the end of the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to look at Matthew chapter 7 this morning, verses 13 to 27. Maybe some of you have already taken time this morning to read that, but we're going to go through these verses this morning and talk about the way that Jesus wraps up his sermon. So from this point on, there's no more teaching on how to live from Jesus, but he wants to talk to us about what do we do with his words. Last week was some of the most encouraging words of the sermon, of talking about going to our Heavenly Father and asking him for the things that we need and just focusing on his generosity. And this section has some hard words of Jesus. There's some tough stuff that we're going to go through this morning, stuff that a lot of us preachers would rather avoid because it's challenging and it's difficult. But we want to hear Jesus in all of this, and he's got actually words of encouragement and words of life for us this morning. So this is Jesus at the end of his sermon. He's wrapping things up, and I know sometimes preachers say, okay, in conclusion, and they go on for another 20 minutes. Here's Jesus' in conclusion, but you can see the end coming. Chapter 8 is coming. So we're going to listen this morning to the conclusion of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. He says in verse 13, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So we have a picture here of a couple of roads. There's a big, wide, easygoing road, and there's lots of people on it, and it's an easy path to walk, and it's pleasant, and there's trees and sunshine, and it's an easy, nice path. And then there's another road, maybe down below, maybe in a ravine somewhere, and it's narrow. And it's tricky, and it goes up and down and around boulders and through streams, and there's tree roots you can trip over, and it's a tough path to walk. And the big wide road looks like a nice easy one. It looks like the one we should be on, but it leads to destruction. And this narrow road leads to life. So what is this small gate? What is this narrow road? This sounds pretty important that we figure this out. We're talking about nothing less than heaven and hell. The roads are a metaphor, but the life and destruction are not. This is Judgment Day that Jesus is talking about. And I think the small gate and the narrow road is actually the whole Sermon on the Mount, what we've just been reading, the kind of living that Jesus has just described. And if we look through the Sermon on the Mount, I don't have my Bible with me here, I'll use this one. This is what the narrow road looks like. People who are meek, people who are merciful, who are pure in heart, people who control their anger, self-control, who control their lust, people who are honest, who let their yes be yes, their no, no, people who don't retaliate, who turn the other cheek, they love their enemies, they give to the needy, but they don't do it to show off for others. Same with prayer and same with fasting. They don't worship money, they worship God instead. They choose not to worry, but they seek his kingdom and his righteousness. They don't judge one another. They ask their Father for what they need. They seek and they knock. All of this, Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, that's what the narrow road is. That's what Jesus is calling us to. And it's a difficult way to live. It is a hard way. Jesus knows that. He's not unaware that this is a challenging way to live. Jesus knows it's tough. But he also knows it's the only way to life. I think if you find being a Christian easy, if there's never any challenges, we need to ask ourselves if we're actually on that narrow path. So you might ask, isn't this salvation by works? Everything in the sermon is about what you do. There's nothing in the sermon actually about believing. That word believe or have faith doesn't show up in the Sermon on the Mount at all. In fact, in all of Matthew's gospel, there's almost nothing about believing or having faith. But the two go together. You can't separate believing from obeying. You can't separate faith from works. If you believe, if you have faith that Jesus is the new king, you're going to live the way that he described in this sermon. Your faith and your works are tied together. And if you don't believe that Jesus is the king, you are never going to live this way anyways. Why would you? So when Jesus spoke, the audience listening, they couldn't separate trusting from obeying. One either did both or they did neither. And then Jesus says something else that's hard. He says, only a few find the narrow gate. This might seem troubling. It might seem like the odds are against us here. There's lots of people who find the wide road, but only a few find the narrow one. But remember what Jesus said just before the narrow gate. He said, ask, and it'll be given to you. Seek, and you'll find. Knock, and the door will be open. If you want to enter the narrow gate and you're unsure, ask for it, and it'll be given to you. No one's going to miss out on the narrow road because they're not good enough. Remember the very first beatitude, the way Jesus started this whole sermon was, blessed are the poor in spirit. Poor in the spirit are the people who have nothing to offer God, and they know it. They're spiritually broken and they need God. Yet these are the people who are on the narrow path. So Jesus isn't warning about not being good enough. He's warning about not asking for it, not seeking it, not knocking at the door. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. It's still just the Beatitudes, all the way through. But the door is tight and the road is narrow. No one will miss out on the narrow road because they couldn't find it, only because they didn't ask for it or seek it. And Jesus gives us just two options here. There's only two paths. There's not three or four. And this wasn't a new idea for Jesus. Jesus got this from his Jewish culture. This was common in Jesus' world to talk about two paths in life. And so if you have your Bibles, go back to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, fifth book in your Bible, and it's at the end of the time of the wandering. So if you know anything about the story of the people of Israel, they escaped from Egypt, they went through the Red Sea, they got the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai, and then they spent 40 years walking around the desert, waiting to get into the Promised Land. And at the end of that 40 years, just before they go in, they're lined up at the river and they're ready to go, and Moses gives them the law all over again. A second time, he wants to remind them, this is how you need to live when you get into the Promised Land. And that's what the book of Deuteronomy is all about. It's all about Moses giving his people God's laws one more time. And I want you to listen to these words of Deuteronomy chapter 30, picking up in verse 11. And it sounds very much like what Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 7. So these are Moses' words. Now what I am commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. It's not up in heaven so that you have to ask, who will ascend into heaven to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it? Nor is it beyond the sea so that you have to ask, who will cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so that we may obey it? No, the word is very near you. It's in your mouth and it's in your heart so that you may obey it. So Moses is saying, it's not too difficult. Yes, it is going to be difficult for these Israelites to live this way, but it's not impossible. And Jesus would say the same thing. Yeah, the narrow road is tough. It's hard, but it's not impossible. You actually can live this way. He continues in verse 15, and here's the two paths. He says, see, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him and to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you're entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you are not obedient, if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. So Moses gives them the two paths. He says, here's the path of life, and it's going to lead to good things if you go down this path. And here's the other path, and if you go down it, it's going to lead to destruction. And then he issues this call in verse 19. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God. Listen to his voice and hold fast to him, for the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years in the land he swore to give to your fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's how Moses ends it. He says, here's the two paths. Now choose the good one. It's the only one that leads to life. And if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, this is what Jesus has been doing all along. He's been showing us these two paths. Either you're going to serve money or you're going to serve God. You're going to do your righteousness to be seen by people or to be seen by God. All the way through, Jesus has been showing us what the narrow path and the wide path look like. It's been right there for us to see the whole time. Later on in Matthew's Gospel, in chapter 25, it's going to shift the metaphor to sheep and goats. And the sheep get to go to life, and the goats are going to go to destruction. If we want to mix these two metaphors, the sheep are the ones who chose the narrow path, and the goats chose the wide path. So what's our default? Which path are we on if we just decide to do nothing? Right? There might be some of us who are saying, well, I see that wide path, and I know those people are just living for their own pleasure and living for themselves. I'm not going to choose that path. I also see what Jesus is calling me to do here, to love my enemies and forgive people, and I'm not quite sure I'm ready to be that serious, so I'm not going to choose that path either. I'm just going to stay here in the middle. I'm not sure Jesus gives us that option. He says there's two paths. And I think the narrow path is an intentional choice that we all have to make. No one can make it for you. I would say if you're not on the narrow path, you're on the wide one. So the question is, will you choose to walk this narrow, difficult path or not? Remembering that it leads to life. If I look at our current situation with COVID-19, what does the narrow path look like? What does the wide path look like? There's a big wide path with lots of people on it who criticize governments and healthcare officials. They complain about the inconveniences of all the things that are going on. They're hoarding up supplies for themselves. But the narrow path looks like something different. We pray for our leaders. We pray for our healthcare workers. We seek to bless each other. We share with each other what we have so that no one is in need. I think there's a real opportunity for us as a church in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis to walk the narrow path. Jesus warns us about who we're going to meet as we walk along this path. Back in Matthew chapter 7, verse 15, he says, "Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit you will recognize them." So remember, Jesus taught us to be pure in heart. Being pure in heart means that what's on the outside is the same as what's on the inside. We're not pretending to be anything else. And now Jesus tells us there are going to be some people who are not pure in heart. They look like sheep on the outside, but on the inside, they're wolves that could devour us. How are we going to know? How are we going to know who's who? Jesus doesn't say it's by their teaching that you'll know, but by their lives, by the way they live their life, by the fruit. Good trees have good fruit, and bad trees have bad fruit. You know, sometimes we can recognize a false prophet by their teaching, which is so obviously false, it's obvious to us. But often it's not nearly so clear. Jesus encourages us to look at the fruit in their life. What kind of a wake goes behind this person? Sometimes what someone preaches may be completely sound. Maybe there's no heresy at all. But the fruit in their life shows that they're a diseased tree. There's certainly been times when the church has been fooled. We judge based on doctrine. Does their theology line up with my theology? And we judge based on numerical success. If it sounds like they've got good theology and their church is growing by leaps and bounds, then they must be a good tree. But Jesus encourages us to look at the fruit in their life. 1 Peter tells us preachers and prophets to be an example to the flock. We have to bear good fruit. I would say if the one who speaks for God is not an example by their life, they're a false prophet. People on the narrow path turn into good trees, and they produce good fruit. And people on the wide path turn into bad trees, and they produce bad fruit. When people are on the narrow path and not the wide one, you'll see it. There will be fruit. We're not talking apples and bananas here. We're talking God's will. We're talking about the Sermon on the Mount. You're going to see this kind of thing in these people's lives. They are going to be the kind of people who forgive. They are merciful. They do love their enemies. That's the kind of fruit that we need to be looking for. And Jesus shows us how it's going to end for some of these people. And the warning is not just for those people, those false prophets. This warning is for us as well. These are some of the toughest words that Jesus has ever preached. Verse 21, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'" This is one of the most hard-hitting statements of Jesus. We're talking about the final judgment day. When Jesus says on that day, he's talking about final judgment here. And it's a picture of the end of the path. Doesn't matter which path you're on, the narrow path or the wide path. At the end of your path, you will meet Jesus. Jesus is the judge. And you can picture this scene. If you want to picture this as the pearly gates in heaven and people are walking on the clouds, that's fine. And there's people who walk up towards the gates of heaven and they're fully expecting to be welcomed in. And as they're walking along and they're striding along, Jesus stops in and says, "Whoa, you're not coming in here. Away from me. You didn't do the will of my Father." These people are going to be surprised. People are going to be shocked. They thought they were in, and it turns out they're not in. There's going to be surprises in heaven. Some people who expect to be there won't be there. And I'd say there's probably some people who we think won't be there, and they will be there. And this seems maybe at first glance to be contrary to what we read in other parts of the New Testament. Romans and Acts both say, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And yet here Jesus is saying some people are going to call him Lord, Lord, and they won't be saved. The difference is that Acts and Romans are talking about this present life. If we call on the Lord in this present life, we will be saved. And keeping in mind that for Paul and the other writers, calling on the Lord didn't just mean saying it. It meant saying, "Jesus, you are my king, and I will live my life as though you are my king." If that's what you do in this present life, you will be saved. But the scenario for Jesus here is not this present life. It's the next one. And when we get there, it won't be enough. See, these people called Jesus Lord. Lord doesn't mean God. Lord, the Greek word kurios, means master or king. So if you were a slave, you would call your slave owner your master, your Lord, your kurios. They're calling Jesus their master, but they didn't live like it. They didn't do the will of the Father. Jesus says, no one gets into the kingdom of heaven, only the one who does the will of my Father. So they were actually not obedient. So if a master tells a slave to go and weed the garden, and the slave says, "Yes, master," or "Yes, Lord," but then he doesn't actually do the will of the master, he can't complain when punishment comes. He can't say, "But I called you master." The slave owner, the master, is going to say, "It doesn't matter what you called me, you didn't do what I asked you to do." It's exactly what Jesus is saying here. So this is the situation of these wide path people on the last day. They get there and Jesus says, "No, you can't come in." And they begin to plead their case. And they say, "Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?" Notice the triple repetition of "in your name." They're saying, "Jesus, we were on your side." And these are big things. Prophecy, casting out demons, performing miracles. If such a person were in our midst, probably most of us would not doubt their authenticity. But these are just 3 examples. There could be lots more. "Lord, Lord, did I not preach hundreds of sermons and lead small groups Bible studies and teach Sunday school? Lord, Lord, did I not go to YWAM and then to Bible school? Lord, Lord, did I not volunteer with the youth group in the seniors' home? Lord, Lord, did I not? Whatever it is. See, these people claimed their gifts, but they failed in their deeds. They didn't actually live out the Sermon on the Mount. We've talked before about whether this was salvation by works. Obviously not. These people have works. They're casting out demons. They're doing miracles. And Jesus says, get out of here. He's not interested in their long resume of all their giftings. He's not interested in ours either. There's one thing that Jesus is looking for. Only the one who does the will of my Father. So what's the will of the Father? It's the sermon he just preached. Did you hold on to grudges or did you forgive people? Did you retaliate or did you turn the other cheek? Did you serve money or did you serve God? Did you do to others what you want them to do to you? This is God's priority for your life. This is God's priority for my life. This is the heart of Jesus' teaching. There may be lots of other things that we are called to. Lots of good things that God is calling us to do. But if these basic things are not happening, if we're not becoming Sermon on the Mount kind of people, we run the risk of showing up on Judgment Day and being turned away. We may have a long list of Christian accomplishments to show Jesus, but he will judge us on whether or not we did the Father's will. Did we become kingdom people? There's two things that disqualify these people. One, they didn't know Jesus. Jesus says, away from me, I never knew you. Do we know Jesus? Are we familiar with him as a master, as a king, as a friend? Because if we know him, we begin to walk like him. We begin to look like him. These people didn't actually know Jesus. And their works were evil. Sure, they had some good things. They were casting out demons and doing miracles. But Jesus still calls them evildoers. So is it possible for people to prophesy and cast out demons and do miracles and still not be one of Jesus' people? I don't know. But what Jesus does make clear is that if these people's lives don't show the golden rule, if they don't show kingdom lifestyles, they're not his people. Jesus comes to the end of his teaching with this on the two houses that we started our whole series on. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rains came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. So this is the end of both paths. Both lead to a storm. The narrow path leads to a house that withstands the storm. And the wide and easy path leads to a house that is destroyed by the storm. Notice what Jesus says, everyone who hears these words and does them. There's no points for listening. It's only doing that results in a solid house. Again and again, Jesus emphasizes obedience. This is really good for us to hear, especially since we often usually emphasize belief. Jesus doesn't use the word belief a single time in this whole sermon, but obviously the two are connected. You wouldn't do one without the other. Your belief and your obedience are tied together. And Jesus wants his disciples to actually live like this. This whole judgment scene is about the one who obeyed. Jesus always uses phrases that imply action and obedience. He says, enter through the narrow gate. He says, the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them. The emphasis here is always on obedience. We have to actually do this. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as the teachers of the law. Sometimes I wish we were as amazed as these crowds were. Some of us have been reading these words for decades, and maybe they become too familiar. I wish we could go back to these original listeners sitting on that green mountainside saying, wow, I can't believe what I just heard. That's a whole new way of living. This is good news. As Jesus had authority. When he spoke, people listened. We get the sense that the other teachers are something like those high school substitute teachers who come in for a day and students don't really listen. But when Jesus spoke, they listened. We would be wise to do so as well. The Sermon on the Mount is not a suggestion. It's not a lofty goal from Jesus saying, hopefully you can get to this point someday. He's saying, if you want to be my people, if you want to be welcomed into my kingdom, this is how you must live. This is what my people do. You either pursue this new kingdom lifestyle or you don't. There's only two groups, Jesus says. And it's a tough call, but he wants us to walk that narrow path. And I know for some of us right now, maybe there's a sense of conviction. Maybe we're looking at that narrow path and saying, boy, I'm not sure I'm on it. I'm not really doing very good at forgiving a lot of people. I don't do well at loving my enemies. I'm not even trying to love my enemies these days. Maybe there's lots of things that we look at and we say, boy, I'm not sure I'm walking that path. Jesus encourages us to ask for it, to seek it, to knock at the door and it'll be opened, that we pursue living this way. It doesn't mean that we do it perfectly, but every day we get up and we say, Jesus, help me walk this narrow path. I'll close with a quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was a Christian in Nazi Germany. And at a time when many of the German churches went along with the Nazi ideology completely, there were a select few, the confessing church, who said, no, this is not the way that Christians should live. They saw what Hitler and others were preaching and said, no, we can't go along with this. And they chose to walk the narrow path, even though lots of people were walking on the wide and easy path. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one of those. It ended up costing him his life in a Nazi concentration camp. And this is what Bonhoeffer writes about walking the narrow path. And it leaves us with a good encouragement. He says, as long as I recognize this road as the one I am commanded to walk, and try to walk it in fear of myself, it is truly impossible. But if I see Jesus Christ walking ahead of me, step by step, if I only look at him and follow him, step by step, then I will be protected on this path. And that's where I want to leave us this morning. That the narrow path is tough. It's a hard road to walk. But Jesus is with us on the road. That's the amazing thing. Maybe throughout this morning, as you visualize yourself on this road, you visualize yourself walking this narrow road by yourself. But now I want you to visualize Jesus walking a couple steps ahead of you. He's been down this road all the way to the end and back. He's loved his enemies. He's shown mercy. He's shown forgiveness. He never says, here's the map, I'll meet you at the end. He actually walks with us. It's a narrow, tricky path. Lots of ups and downs and things to trip over. But Jesus knows it like the back of his hand. And he walks right beside us. And he shows us how to walk that narrow path. And not only that, there's others of us together walking this path with Jesus. In fact, there's a whole line of us walking this narrow path. Jesus said, only a few find it, but that doesn't mean you or I are the only ones. There's lots of us who are committed to living our life on this narrow path. And so we're in this together, and we're in this with Jesus. And we see that wide, easy path. It's not far away. You can see it from the narrow path. And it looks like a better path. It looks like it might even be heading in the same direction. But Jesus is not on that path. He's not on the wide, easy one. Jesus is on the narrow path. I'm on the narrow path. You're on the narrow path together. And so I just want to encourage us as a church this morning that we continue to seek that narrow path. It's not easy. It might be really tough. But in the end, it leads to life. Life eternal with Jesus. Let's close in prayer.